Now we come on to the new film by Pablo Larrain, Maria, which is written by Stephen Knight and stars Angelina Jolie as the most famous opera singer of all time. You could argue Maria Callas. Now, I went to see this film, and about 5 minutes in, the projector failed, so I actually haven't had the chance to complete it. So I'm relying on you, Jake, to give me the lowdown on what I missed out on. Was this film good? Should I go and catch up on it? Tell me everything.
Well, I think I'm getting a bit of a reputation on this show as having some slightly controversial opinions. This film has been lauded. Gosh knows why. I detested the film. Detested,
Wow.
hated it. I hated every aspect of it, maybe apart from costume and set design, because they were beautiful and locations were beautiful. However, I had a really, really palpable hatred for it. I could not stand it. For many reasons, is that this is a story about Maria Callas. I know less about Maria Callas after this film than I did going in, and I knew very little. I find this film exploitative. I find it just pretentious, and I find it a really inaccurate representation of an artist and a musician. I find it doesn't care about that aspect of Maria Callas, which seems ridiculous because she is the most famous opera singer, definitely the most famous female opera singer, next to probably Pavarotti is the most famous male opera singer. Even if you have never heard of her name, if you've heard those beautiful arias, you would have heard her voice. You know, even going in, I was like, oh, do I know what Maria Callas's voice really sounds like separately? But when it plays, you're like, yes, that is the voice of 1,000 beautiful melodies. I thought that this film was really a dangerous representation of certain aspects of this character. I think the film is misnamed. It's called Maria, but it should really be called The Death of Maria Callas. It does not deal with anything that made Maria Callas who she was in regards to her artistry or her perfection of her artistry. It only cares about her trauma. And I find that really distasteful in a
Yeah.
way. I did find it distasteful in this film. I know that a lot of biopics that deal with musicians deal with an artist trauma. It seems to be the crux. We want to see it. We want to see their pain and them to get through it. However, they also, in many biopics that deal with the beauty of their own performance, what they find their performance, what they engage with it. This film was only concerned with the pain she felt about performing in the end, how she was no longer the grand prima donna she once was, how that everything was causing her pain, everything was causing her death. And even if that is accurate, I think that it is such an abysmal representation of what makes that human being a human. I don't think you would have got to it in the 5 minutes, but it's a key proponent of the film. There's an aspect where she's having delusions because
Yes.
she's cognitively disassociating and she is very mentally ill. She's on a lot of medication, and the medication brings out representations of delusion.
Yes.
One of the aspects is a TV crew follows her throughout the film, but they are, and this isn't a spoiler because it's very obvious from the editing choices that initially we are supposed to understand they do not exist. The TV director is portrayed by smit-mcphee in one of the most ridiculous performances I've ever seen.
I think he's a tremendous actor.
He's a tremendous actor, but in this film, it was embarrassingly pretentious. You know what it felt like with this TV crew following her around? It felt like a student production trying to add nuance to a human being that already has a lot of nuance to them. There is a lot of going back to some aspects of her past as well that cut in between as though we are looking at a kind of documentary view of her. However, again, it is nothing to do with her roles on stage, nothing to do with her learning to really become the greatest singer. It only talks about it. It only concerns itself with moments of sheer pain. The occupation of Greece by Germany and her own abuse by German soldiers, her meeting and abuse by Aristotle Onassis, and their love affair that is only seen negative, view the visual presentation, however, is talked about and romanticized as though it was the true love that defined her. And anyone who knows the story of Aristotle Onassis, he's a horrible person to both of his wives. Well, he was never married to Maria Callas, but was awful to his first wife and awful to Jackie Kennedy, who gets lots of mentions in this, which is quite fitting as he made the Jackie Kennedy film. I am obviously, as we've discussed in previous Cinema Spotlights, I trained musician and I trained musicology as well, and specifically on opera in certain aspects. I was never raised loving opera. Opera is a very hard thing to get into if you're not really in that world. It's very inaccessible. However, I do believe that it should be accessed by a wider range of people because it is so beautiful and is such a progenitor for what came after that it needs to be recognized and supported. And therefore, films like this, I thought, what a great idea to make the Maria Callas movie so people can watch this brilliant performer, engage in something and be like, yes, I want to see that opera because I watched this film and that music really resonated with me. This film does not care itself about any of the work that she involved in. It has a lot of her singing, but it doesn't tell us what this is or who it is by or what she's actually performing, only fragments. It is as inaccessible as opera. I don't think it cared. I think it only cared about the dying artist, the tragedy. It cared about the misery of and the pain and the longing pain. And Angelina Jolie's performance is really interesting. You know, her acting's good, but I had no point throughout the entire film did I believe that she was Maria Callas. The music that she used when she sings is her actual voice, Maria Callas's voice.
Okay.
And to be honest, it just seems like a B-tier lip sync from RuPaul's Drag Race. I did not believe it was her because, again, maybe only because I come from a singing background, that I thought a lot of her acting performance, even though I'm sure she did a lot of research, it didn't feel like it was accurate to the type of singing she was doing. I've been around a lot of opera singers. I know how the functionality of singing works. And it just felt that she didn't have enough breath to control those notes. I wasn't really structuring the mouth in the right way. To anyone who would, that's a very personal gripe.
No, but that's brilliant because this is where, you know, your knowledge and your sort of specialism are really interesting for us to hear about because, you know, if something isn't convincing on screen, then you're going to notice. And that, I think, says something about the production. You know, I wonder why, given that they will have had so much money to spend on getting those things right, why hasn't that been done correctly? And I can definitely see why, you know, from your point of view, watching the film, that is going to translate into not believing the story. And to be honest, I mean, on a perhaps more subtle level, you know, I think audiences do pick up on that kind of thing. I've definitely sat there watching things and thinking, you know, this doesn't feel quite real. And then later you find out, oh, okay, it's because it's a dodgy lip sync, or, you know, this just isn't a very good kind of performance. But I think audiences are kind of smarter about these things, often on an intuitive level than we think. And I bet other people have had the same gripe, even if they can't articulate it in the way that you can.
It's a thing that it did feel slightly disconnected. And I felt people in the audience that it was a really interesting screening I went to. Everyone was very fidgety. I find maybe they were reacting because it's a miserable film. I think you could say that there's nuance in misery. I think all three of the films we watched deals with an aspect of pain in a certain way, but I think A Real Pain puts this film really to shame because it deals with something very heavy but does it nuanced. I think a lot of people just look at Maria Callas in this film like she's this wounded, dying baby deer or this wilting flower.
Yeah.
And like she doesn't want to help herself. She's a very obtuse character. And it's like, well, we're never given the reason to understand how she got there or why she maybe deserves or can get away with being such an arrogant, well, prima donna. I think that's the best way to describe it. But because we don't see her struggle to become a great singer. We only see snippets of the moments that don't really matter for when you're watching a film about an artist. It's like watching a film about Neil Armstrong and him never getting to the moon. We need to see the idea of why someone does something to then understand the pain that comes later.
Yeah.
And it's beautifully shot, and it's shot in different formats for different things, but it does feel like a film experiment because there's lots of Super 8 footage that cuts in. There's lots of black and white. There's lots of long, drawn-out takes. There's editing choices. There's surrealism. It's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of things to juggle. I think one of the only nice things I can say about this is the actor who plays Aristotle Onassis is a dead ringer. They look so alike. I think, even though I say all this, I have very strong opinions. And of course, this is about a musician and music that, you know, I love. And therefore I felt kind of, well, I don't think you did it a good service. I genuinely thought exploitative is a word I have used previous in this review, but also I would echo again, because it feel like you're just mining her for her tragedy. And I feel like it's in poor taste. I know it's a long time since she died in the late 70s, but it still feels really egregious. I'd love you to go see it though, because there might be aspects of this that I'm being too harsh on, because that bitter taste followed me throughout, because you get it quite early on in the film, because there's just aspects that you kind of get to the point where you understand that it isn't going to be that type of film. It's more concerned about this very specific moment where she's very sick and dying. And again, okay, I applaud a film for not trying to cram in a person's life into just, 2 hours.
Yeah.
Because that's a problem that a lot of biopics have, is it tries to tell their entire story and misses out very key points and doesn't really create an emotional connection. But I feel like this was just wallowing. It didn't really create an emotional connection for me. And the film ends with lots of clips of the real Maria Callas, and then you're kind of like, well, Angelina Jolie doesn't really look anything like her. And also, she doesn't really sound in the right way like her, because of course with a singer you have to sound like her voice. And I think a lot of actors come close to, and we'll be talking about a film similar to that where a singer uses his own voice when we talk about the Bob Dylan film next week. And there's a lot of balance that can be struck, but this film just, go see it, because you might have a wildly different experience, Reuben.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I will. I look forward to updating you. I was just thinking, gosh, this is going to be an interesting comparison piece for, yes, A Complete Unknown, which is going to be on next week's show, because I wonder if, this is something to do with the way that, kind of cinema views women often. I think there is often a tendency for biographical films, when they're dealing with male figures, to be much less kind of trauma porny. Whereas, if you look at something like Blonde, which, was very criticized at the time for, people felt reducing Marilyn Monroe's life essentially into, just all the horrible bits where she was being abused by men. It sounds like this kind of goes down a similar path, and I do think that that's not really something that we see when we're dealing with great male actors or singers or whatever. That's not the narrative that we choose to spin. So I'm very intrigued. I'm kind of looking forward to it, because I wonder if, because I don't have the musical knowledge, maybe I'll be a bit more forgiving of certain things. But certainly, it doesn't sound like you'd be nominating Angelina Jolie at the Golden Globes anytime soon. Do you think she'll be up for the Oscar?
I think maybe as a peace offering, or a sort of like, we recognize that you still exist in Hollywood. We recognize this, and as those sort of things do happen, like, it's a decent performance as long as it wasn't a real person. I think it has nuances in that sense, but it may have worked for this film and what this film wanted to achieve. But I think the film fails on a whole, so therefore I think she fails in it. I can't give her a passing for it, but I think she'll probably get nominated. I'd be shocked if she ever came close to winning. So yeah, it's Maria, the most beautiful sound I've ever heard. Not so much in this film. I'd love to hear your point of view on it, though, Ruben. So we'll chat after you've been able to finally have a successful viewing of it, I think.
Maria, I've got to see her. Terrible puns today.